Hi kids! One concept that we haven't touched on fully in these little video chats is the idea of adding integers. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time now. Ooh, my pen tip is thinner. Adding integers. Remember the checkers. We said that if we had, I'm going to have the open circles be positive and the closed, well actually let's have the closed circles be positive. So if I have two closed or positives and I add three positives, it's pretty clear that I have 5 positives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In other words, as you well know, 2 plus 3 equals 5. What if I were adding 2 negative numbers? Think back to the checkers. Let's just say this is a negative. If I have 2 negatives and I put 3 more negatives into the set, you can see that I have 5 negatives. In other words, negative 2 plus negative 3 is equal to negative 5. From those two examples, you can see that if I have all of the same kind of a number, I just add them, and I have more of that kind. In other words, if I have like signs, I add. Okay? If you think back to the checkers, that's always pretty obvious. What if, on the other hand, I had 2 positives and I put into that same pile 3 negatives? You may recall from the, let's see, what were those things? The flour sack thing, when we were adding a lot of positive and negative numbers. Any number plus its opposite equals 0. So in other words, if we think of these things doing battle, these two guys cancel each other out. They equal 0. Positive 1 and negative 1 together. If I put those together, I've got 0. And that leaves over 1 negative. Okay? So basically, these take each other out, and it leaves that. In math, what we've just shown is that 2 plus negative 3 is equal to negative 1. By the same token, if these 2 were negative and these 3 were positive, we could see that 2 of them are still going to cancel each other out. But the one that's left over now is positive, showing us that negative 2 plus 3 is positive 1. In either situation, notice, if I've got 3 and I subtract 2, I've got 1. If I've got 3 and I subtract 2, I've got 1. It's like subtraction because these are taking each other out. Taking away is subtraction. How do I know what the sign is going to be? Well, in a battle, it's the side that started out with more. So, in other words, if you have unlike signs, you subtract. And in the answer, you use the sign with more. This is actually an application of another concept that we're doing in this unit. We talked about the idea of absolute value as a distance from 0. So the absolute value notation is this. If I say the absolute value of negative 8, if I drew a number line, oh, I should have used a smaller number. Oh well. Here's my number line. This is negative 8, negative 7, negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0. So from negative 8 to 0, I have 8 spots. The absolute value of -8 is +8. On the other hand, if I say the absolute value of 4, I'm going to be smart and use an easier number. Here's my number line. If this is 0, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 units away from 0. So the absolute value of a negative number is positive, and the absolute value of a positive number is positive, because you can't have negative distance. So whenever you see these straight line symbols, it's the absolute value. And if we go back to our addition problem, if I say -3 plus 2, I've got unlike signs, I'm going to subtract, and I use the sign of the number that has the greater absolute value. That's a mathematical way of saying the sign that had more to begin with. We know that addition and subtraction are related. They're opposite operations, but in particular, we talked about the fact that when I'm subtracting, let's say 3 minus 2. We know 3 minus 2 is 1. That's exactly the same answer and the same procedure as 3 plus -2. That also equals 1. In fact, always, in any situation, subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Always. Adding the opposite. You never change that first number. You just change the second. You change the subtraction to an adding, and you change it to the opposite. And we would never change addition. The whole idea of this is that once you've learned to add integers, you actually know how to subtract too. Whether you choose to slash and dash, as we call adding the opposite, is up to you, except for in one situation. Using that whole idea, 3 minus 2 equals 1, it's easier to just leave that the way it is. You don't need to slash and dash. But if I had 3 minus -2, it's hard to know what I've got unless I remember that subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. So that gives me +5. This comes into play when we're adding a bunch of like terms as well, which you will see in another video, but -3 plus 5x minus -4 minus 8. Before I even begin to do this problem, I need to slash and dash this. I could slash and dash the -8, but in some ways it's easier just to box all the things that are the same and put the sign in front of them, and understand that this means I'm putting together -3, +4, and -8, giving me a total of -7. So the answer to this is 5x minus 7. I think those are the main ideas of adding and subtracting. You can, if you want, always. If you say -3 minus 8, this is sometimes tricky for kids. You can think of this as putting together -3 and -8. That equals -11. Or, if it's easier for you, you can always remember that subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. So the truth is, once you understand how to add, which is like signs add, unlike signs subtract, use the sign of the greater absolute value in your answer, you also know how to subtract. The tricky thing is just getting it so that you can see what's going on in each problem.